So welcome to the podcast, Moments That Could Have Changed Football Forever. I'm Peter Thornton, joint author of the book with my good friend Peter Prickett.
Hi, guys.
Now. And today we have a very special guest known throughout the land of Twitter as Coaching Badges, our very good friend and academy manager at Bray Wanderers, Gavin Teehan.
Oh, listen, guys, firstly, thanks to you both for inviting me on to chat. I've kind of engaged with you guys for a long time on Twitter. And in fact, one of the Pete's has been on our own podcast. So, but listen, I've thoroughly enjoyed the book. I'm absolutely delighted and looking forward to discussing the Pele part of it this evening. So yeah, look, thank you both for having me on. Really appreciate it.
So you've headed us off at the pass there, Gavin, with your chosen subject. What if Pele had played in Europe? What made you choose that one?
Well, I'm of a certain vintage. I won't give away my age, but let's just say I've been a fan of Pele for a long time. He would have been one of my first football heroes. So when I got the book initially and I flicked down through all the what ifs, because there's some amazing what ifs in the book, but I immediately was drawn to the Pele one because, you know, I'm a huge fan of his and you'll probably glean that as we talk about him later. But I do get the fact that there are people out there who will always, you know, hold it against him, the fact that he didn't play in Europe and does that tarnish his legacy somewhat. So I was really fascinated by that chapter. And then having read it, it got me thinking about so many other what ifs around Pele. So yeah, no, I'm delighted to chat about Pele at any time, but particularly in reference to that what if question. I think
I have to say it was Pete, you found that was your little thing, wasn't it? That you thought, you know, what if he played in Europe and particularly with the legacy sort of idea. That's what drew you to it, Pete, I think, wasn't it?
Yeah, because it just sort of struck me as, and for a long time, like when I was growing up, it was almost like there was no doubt that Pele was the greatest ever, because Maradona was slightly cast aside in England for the hand of God reasons. So it could only be Pele. But then I think things started to change with the emergence of Messi and Ronaldo and their great goal-scoring feats. And that you sort of started to get this thing with, well, most of Pele's goals were scored in friendlies. Well, they played 400 league games a season in Brazil. Of course they're going to score that many goals, etc., etc. And I think also Romario is quite linked to this. Because when Romario got his 1,000 goals, they released a video or DVD, and he included goals he scored at youth team level. And it kind of made people think that Pele had done exactly the same thing as that and diminished that legacy even further. And it just astonishes me that it was being questioned. So I decided to have a dig into why that might be. And I do think that one of the big reasons why is because people downplayed the Brazilian league and the competitions out there compared to European football. A massive bias there.
Totally. And look, hopefully, boys, we'll get into this as we chat, because there's evidence both ways, but certainly there's some fascinating stuff to discuss. But I have to say, I listened back to your first episode, which I really enjoyed, about the Real Madrid team. But in that you mentioned recency bias, and I couldn't help but say, I think there's a little bit of that when it comes to Pele as well, because naturally you have a lot of younger people now who rightly think that Messi and Ronaldo and all are incredibly talented footballers. But Pele, you're dead right, Pete. When I was growing up, there was never a doubt as to who was the greatest. But like,
when did you come across him, Gav? First, 70 World Cup?
Oh, well, 70 World Cup I've watched I don't know how many times. And, you know, as I started to get into my coaching life years later, I used to watch that back just for a bit of pleasure. But no, I was a kid probably in the 80s when I discovered him and tried to find out more about him. And back then it was more that you just had to find books and stuff. Like, you think back, there was no YouTube, there was no social media. So trying to find information on players was difficult. But certainly the way the kind of elders around me spoke about Pele, I was like, wow, I need to find out more about this guy. He seems to be like a god in football terms. So yeah, once I started to get older, and then obviously as social media and all did, open up as the years went by, and you started to get your hands on more footage about him, like it was unquestionable to me that he was absolutely one of the best, and rightly so, should be mentioned up there with the Maradonas and the Cruyffs and the Puskasses and Georgie Bests and all these absolute greats of the game. But yeah, I think we have a job, and it's gas because I do think I coach now, and you constantly try and reference modern players to younger players to make it relevant to them. And I do think there's some players that I've encountered over the last number of years who don't really know who Pele is. They know he was good and they know he was famous, but they really don't understand how good and how famous he was.
Yeah.
And
I was lucky. I was like I was 9 in '66, so I saw England pick it up. But I can remember being immensely disappointed when he was injured and he was out of the tournament. Because you just wanted to see him. And then 1970, we saw him at his brilliant best. In arguably one of the great World Cup sides and one of the great World Cups. But that was something you factored in, wasn't it, Pete? Into the
yeah, I mean, we're very lucky to have the 1970 World Cup because Gav, you mentioned Puskás there. Trying to find footage of him, I mean, that's tough, really tough. But we're so lucky to have that footage from 1970 to show him that Pele in, I was going to say all his glory, but not even all his glory, because this is the 29-year-old well-rounded Pele rather than the younger, unstoppable goal machine Pele.
Oh, yeah.
Which we don't really have a lot of footage of. Yeah.
He's got his man body there as well. You can tell, can't you? You see him as a skinny kid, and he's quite an elusive runner. But he's a chunky guy, isn't he? In 1970, he takes some knocking off the ball.
Yeah, and he looks, his game, as you rightly said, looks a lot more rounded in 70. Like he becomes the provider a lot more in 70 as well. But he's just the way he plays the game. Like you're dead right. Funny looking back ahead of this discussion, I was looking at trying to find out more about him as a young player, and even then, it's ridiculous to think that in his first, I think it was his first 3 years at Santos, from around 58 to 60, when he was just coming on the Brazilian scene, like he scored 138 goals in 3 years, and he's only 17, 18, and 19 years of age then. So it's phenomenal, and then. He's famous, obviously, for being one of the youngest, if not the youngest World Cup winner ever. And he scores twice in the final. But I think people forget, like he scores 2 against Sweden, but he gets a hat-trick against France in a semi-final. Yeah. And he gets 1 against Wales in a quarterfinal. So at that end of the tournament, quarterfinal, semi, and final, he gets 6 goals, in a World Cup final at 17. Like, it's ridiculous.
It's absolutely quite good, that, isn't it?
yeah, just a bit. Imagine how he would be treated if, like, remember when Michael Owen burst on the scene for England as a 19-year-old and he gets that amazing goal against Argentina and how he blows up. Imagine if there was social
Wayne
media.
In it. Wayne. I remember, there was so much excitement about Wayne bursting on the scene. And, it's one of the things me and Peter have talked long and hard about is, what age do footballers peak now? Because you think of Michael Owen, you think of Wayne, and, they're probably at the best under 25, the pair of them. Yeah. They were unbelievably good. Whereas, to be fair, with Pele, what was his peak? He rightly pointed out those goals, when he was 17, but it's difficult to look past that 1970, isn't it, for all we've talked.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, totally. And in fairness, across his number of World Cups that he played in and won, obviously, you've got his club career that we'll talk about, and you've got his international career. And the one thing for me is that regardless of how he's evolved as a player physically, he has scored goals across all of those years. So literally, from the late 50s up into the 70s, he's scoring regularly at a phenomenal rate. So again, like when you look Santos alone, I think 643 goals in 659 competitive games. Like, so I get the people who'll argue about the friendlies and the tours that Santos did and his games in the army and all that kind of stuff. But competitively, he scored at a phenomenal rate. So yeah, look, it's a great subject. And happy to chat about it. Like, it really is something you could talk about forever.
One of the interesting things, I think, obviously we came up with the idea together, and we wrote the chapters separately. But I love the way that Peter approached it, and then tell us what refresh our memories, Pete, as to why you picked the team you did that he played for in Europe. I think that's always really fascinating, that one.
Well, I was going to choose initially, just because I could, I was going to choose Benfica because I had this vision of pairing up Pele and Eusebio.
And he spoke Portuguese, obviously.
And he spoke Portuguese, and there was the connection there. But very few Brazilians came to Europe during that time.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, something that people forget about. And even the 70s, not coming to Europe. The 80s, they start to come to Europe, the big stars, but not really. Zico and Socrates, when they come to Europe, they're around 30.
Yeah.
They've had their careers in Brazil. So it wasn't really till the late 80s and 90s where Brazilian players came to Europe and the volume that they do now. So there were Brazilian players in Syria in the 60s, and rooting around and looking through the research, I found that he was actually really, really close to joining Inter Milan. A bid had been accepted, and the only reason it collapsed was because the fans rioted, essentially. And it all got the contract was torn up, and the move never happened. So that's why I chose Inter.
Where would you have? You've got a magic wand, Gavin. Where would you have put him?
Oh, well, I tell you, again, Pete's logic there is brilliant, because when you do the research, you see that there was a number of places he could have gone. And the beauty about these conversations is that we can use our imaginations, right? So when I looked at this, I actually said to myself, right, in a modern era, that 17, 18-year-old Pele who bursts on the scene in 58, like, Real Madrid still had 3 European Cups to come that they were going to win out of that famous 5 in a row. So you'd wonder, could they have said, you know what, we'll splash money and go after this kid, because they had the money. They were one of the biggest clubs in the world back then. So that in itself is a tantalizing prospect as to would they do that, and where would he fit into that amazing Real Madrid team, right? Then you're absolutely right, Pete. The first place I looked at myself was Benfica. But when I did a little bit of digging on that, I kind of realized that, right, couple of things. One, the skipper of Benfica was their centre forward. So would they have got rid of their skipper to bring in Pele? Jose Agues, I think, captained them to the 61 final. But interestingly, they beat Barcelona that year in that final. And Barcelona did have a Brazilian centre forward playing for them, Evaristo. And I don't know if he was from Spain or Brazil originally and how he ended up at Barcelona. But I thought that was interesting that Pele could end up with a fellow Brazilian at Barcelona. They were the two teams that competed at. And then rightly, as you say, the fact that Eusebio is on the scene as well. Like, what a prospect that would have been to see Pele and Eusebio lace up together. Like,
the thing that always attracts me to that Benfica thing is the curse, the curse that the manager put on Benfica. And then, they really haven't won a final since then. And it's like, Peter's brilliant matchup with the one that you've just said, Pele and Eusebio, curse and nothing. You're thinking they would have won something, wouldn't they?
Well, you reckon they'd have been decent. And in fairness, I didn't realize myself until I went back and looked at this that, like, Benfica contested 3 finals in a row, from early 60s. They were only beaten by Milan, I think, in the following 63, I think, the AC Milan team. Yeah. But you're right then, that Inter team that you do pick in the book, that's a pretty decent side. Like, when they come along and you look at them and you say, okay, again, they're interestingly you said there wasn't many Brazilians over, but there was, I think, in that Inter side in 64.
That was one of the reasons why I thought Inter might work, because there was already a Brazilian player there.
That's right, your man Da Costa, I think. So that's an interesting one. And at that point as well, they have, I don't know him now, but Milani as a centre forward. So, again, you would imagine that if Pele comes on the scene, he fits comfortably anywhere in that top three.
I think that's one of the joys of the book, to be honest. I know we wrote it, but as you sort of pointed out, there's always like a grain of truth or a grain in there, in the fantasy sections, where you can go back and go, well, Inter Milan had him, and I think it's a really good call, Inter. And I think what is interesting as well, had he gone there, you're changing the idea of Italian football, aren't you?
Oh, completely. Like, I think Catenaccio had become quite popular back then, where, they were famously quite defensive. And that's another argument, I guess, that people throw at, would Pele have scored as many goals against more defensive European sides? But, I think Pele fits into any side and they get goals.
See, I always think it's really interesting that Catenaccio comes from Herrera at Inter.
Yeah.
But he always maintains that he wasn't a defensive coach, and it's the people who copied him who made it more defensive. And if you look at their goals and how many goals they scored, they were essentially the top scorers every season in Serie A. Yeah. We just talked about the 64-65 season. They scored 2 goals a game in Serie A, 68 goals in 34 games. And they had somewhere in amongst those seasons in the 60s, a 70-goal season.
That's right.
So they're not that defensive.
Yeah. No, I think you're right, but I think it's the other teams that tried to adapt Herrera's concept that made it quite defensive, because you're right. He always said he played more like vertical attacking football. So just very interesting to see how he would fit in that. But like you've the tantalizing prospect if he goes to Inter and he's there during that famous spell, kind of mid to late 60s, where that Inter Milan side are in 3 out of 4 finals or something. And famously the one that Celtic win in 67. What about Pele playing for Inter Milan against Celtic? Like, that could have been something else,
Yeah, Billy McNeil would have just taken him out, wouldn't
he? Yeah. Well, I know my good friend and co-host of the Coaching Badges podcast, Mark Anderson, would have some thoughts on that, been a Celtic diehard. But I would love to have seen Pele, playing a European Cup final against Celtic. That would have been class. And then if he stays there, or if he had gone to Benfica, you have the possibility of the following year him maybe playing for Benfica against Man United. So there's so many what if he did come over. And realistically, the big sides at the time were Benfica, your Inter Milan, and soon to be Ajax if he stayed on in Europe that long. Like, what about the possibility of a kind of aging Pele going to Ajax, which is just would blow your mind. Imagine him playing with Cruyff. Yeah, a young Cruyff, 24, 25-year-old Cruyff, just kind of really making his mark. And then Pele coming to the end of his time in his 30s, 31.
I think this is where the grain of truth element comes in, because it just depends on how fantastical you want to be.
Yeah,
because you can make that case. I mean, the chances of Pele playing for Ajax at that time, Ajax didn't bring players, big names in. They didn't sign people from abroad. They didn't pay big wages, which is why most of the players went. It's not going to. It's not. It's highly unlikely. The suspension of disbelief for me cuts off. I don't know. I can't countenance that one.
Yeah,
it wouldn't happen. But
I think it depends on the power that the footballer has. You're thinking sort of pre-agents here, and I know they were influenced all the time, but at that end of his career, would he have had more choice to go, listen, I want to go where I want to go now? Whereas they probably don't have that much choice now, do they? Possibly they do.
It's an interesting one. I do think back then you probably had more loyalty to a club as well. So there's a lot more arguments about people staying at a club for a long career. Whereas you look at modern players now, and with the power of player power and agent power, a lot of players now will move around. And there is a kind of a circus of clubs that can afford these megastars. So sometimes they do the rounds as they get towards the latter end of their career. But I do think Pele's one was fascinating because I think he was becoming bigger than the game of football. He was probably the first global superstar. So it would have been fascinating to see if we had modern day agents, modern day media deals, modern day social media. Like, would Pele's life have just become a crazy media circus, where he did the tour of Europe and played for the top 3 or 4 clubs? You don't know. But that's the beauty of these.
Would he have got a part in Escape to Victory if he hadn't?
To a certain generation, that is a brilliant football film.
Yeah, John Watt got in it, didn't he?
Yeah.
Didn't he, John? And that young lad that breaks his arm in the film, innit, so he couldn't play in goal and all that.
That's right.
So,
he was an Irish lad. Oh my goodness!
Callahan was his name?
Kieran Callahan or something like that, or something Callahan.
Ipswich. Yeah, Ipswich, isn't it? I think.
There you go. There you go.
And I also think that the footballers acted better than the actors, and the actors played football better than the footballers when it came to it in that film.
Let's not forget Sylvester Stallone in goal.
Who is about 5'4", by the way, isn't it? That's what was ridiculous about it.
Well, that still is a Christmas movie in this household, so I watch it pretty regularly.
What if the Munich air crash had never happened?
What if Michael Owen had stayed fit?
What if Ajax never sold?
These are just some of the things discussed in a brand new book, Moments That Could Have Changed Football Forever. Every what if moment in the book has been chosen to spark debate. Buy your copy now online at Amazon or Waterstones.
It's quite interesting, that point, because the media circus, Peter, in it, is something that you naturally get today, but there was only very few players in that era that could command that type of thing, didn't they?
Well, I think the measure, if there was one, was when they got off the plane, because that was what happened with George Best, wasn't it?
Yeah.
So George Best was mobbed by the media when he got off the plane after his magnificent performances in Europe, and Pele was treated similarly when he got off the plane, when he arrived elsewhere. And that showed how big a presence he was, transcending football, because he was a global star. I mean, Americans had heard of him.
Yeah.
Which I think is probably at that time the biggest measure you could give. They cared not a jot for football in the 60s. I couldn't even tell you how well the USA men's national team was doing in the 60s, because I'd never really seen much of a mention of them.
No, you're absolutely right. I heard and read a fascinating snippet about in the 60s, when he was now obviously pretty well established, well known globally. There was 2 warring factions in Nigeria, stopped a civil war for 48 hours to agree so they could all go and watch Pele playing in a game in Lagos. Like that now you've got power. So, you know what I mean? You end up drawn with the local side 2-2, Pele scores, everybody's happy, and then they all go back to war. You know?
He was crazy. I would guess he was, because I lived through the 60s and can remember it quite well, but I would guess he was only behind Muhammad Ali.
I think you're right.
Be my guess.
Yeah, I think you're right, because I, as I said, I remember my grandparents speaking fondly of the likes of Ali. Then my father and that generation talking about Pele, and how they'd literally, be going around trying to get snippets in newspapers or on radio about how he was doing, where he was playing, the games he was involved in. And he's certainly held in high reverence with that older brigade. And I think a newer generation are discovering him again, with the likes of, there was the brilliant Netflix documentary about Pele. So, people starting to understand just how big he was and how successful he was. But he's a fascinating character, and was all his life. He did so much more outside of football after he retired. But an absolute, certainly in my top 3 sports stars of all time.
Yeah, it's quite interesting, because you never get that now with South American players, do you? They never stay. The top players never stay. It's difficult to imagine us having this discussion about Lionel, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah. And do you think it's just purely money that they all leave now, because of the fact that the money is in Europe as opposed to South America?
Yeah. well, you know, today City have just signed Argentina's, you know, next number 10, haven't they? A 17-year-old lad for 14 million. You know, they get them so young nowadays. You know, it's amazing. You know, you think of Pele coming to Europe when he was 17, straight after that World Cup. You know, it's like, ooh, you know, it's a different thing altogether, isn't it? You know.
I read that so just after 58, obviously 17, he's just come into prominence. Everybody's starting to know about this kid. So naturally, football being football, people are sniffing around, kind of wondering, could they sign him? And my understanding is that the actual government of Brazil stepped in 61, and they declared Pele a national treasure. So he was prevented from being transferred out of the country, which is incredible. Absolutely incredible.
Give us the Elgin marbles back.
Yeah. There you go. I've never heard that about
it. Great idea, that, isn't it? Yeah, we want all our star players back.
But it is indicative of a different times, because Puskás, as was mentioned before, we can mention him again. We can mention all of those Eastern European players because of government intervention, communism. They were not allowed to sign for other clubs. They were not allowed to leave unless they were on an official tour. And they essentially had to defect, which they did, in order to sign for the clubs in Spain. Wow. So government intervention to prevent players from leaving in the 50s, 60s, even 70s absolutely happened. It can't happen now because of the way that laws and rules have all changed. But it was very much a factor then. Yeah.
I always remember, you know, you're talking about like the 1970 World Cup, and then, you know, Pele was in it. And I always remember 1974, and you saw the Brazil team. It was like, who are these? Yeah. You know, it was like such a letdown that most of that great team by that time had gone. You know.
Yeah. It's amazing. It's funny, even looking at the past European Cup winners, seeing those trends of how different countries go through cycles, where you obviously had that famous Real Madrid team early on, very heavily Spanish influence finals. I think Real Madrid were in the first 7 of the first 9 finals or something crazy.
Yeah.
And then you have that wave of the Benfica side, then it becomes the Italian sides, then it becomes the Dutch sides, later to become the English sides. So, you know, it seems to go in these cycles of maybe it's just where all the good players end up that strengthens a particular league or country. But that's interesting that there's more and more of it now, one-off nations winning it, but back then there was chunks of a time when it was one country dominated.
I think with the late 50s and 60s, Syria was definitely the place that brought in imported great players.
Yeah.
For a while it was English players, but they never really worked. When Welshmen worked very well, and John Charles, but they were the place that imported the players. When they tended to do it in trios, it seemed to work. Milan had the trio of Swedish players, and then they repeated the trick many years later with the trio of Dutch players, and then Spain was the other place that imported players, but only 2 clubs really in Barcelona and Real Madrid. England didn't import players. Germany didn't really import players. The big leagues were far more closed off and far more reliant on their own ability to produce players. Yeah. But it meant the talent pools were much bigger than they are now. Whether the top quality at that elite end of the pools is good is another question, but it was certainly a much bigger pool. Less reliant on imported players.
I know that The Athletic at the minute, aren't they? One of their lead articles on Twitter is that, you know, Newcastle United have got 6 players who supported the club. Do you think that, you know, nowadays it's a big so what to me, that?
Yeah.
What would you say?
Every time there's a press conference and a player signs, they all seem to support the club. So
I always think Robbie Keane, for about 3 club signings in a row, kept saying it was his dream to play for Celtic. It was his dream to play for Liverpool. It was his dream to play for Tottenham. I was like, oh my God, how many dreams did you have as a kid?
It's amazing how a big wad of cash sort of makes you dream, doesn't it?
Stuff.
When I was a kid, I always dreamed of playing in Saudi Arabia. Said no one ever.
See that could have been like now. That is probably where he'd have finished up, Pele, wasn't it? Ironically, you know, he went to America.
Seeing him have the money,
yeah. But now that all the old footballers will go out to grass in Saudi Arabia until they sign, you know, Pele, you know, the equivalent of Pele young, won't they? And then everyone will go, ooh.
It's amazing how it does go in these cycles. And we're seeing that wave of players been attracted, you know, to the likes of the Saudi League for money, I can only imagine. And where will the next wave be? But one thing's for sure, I don't think we'll ever see the likes of a Pele again, who will come from, you know, be born in a particular country, stay there all his life and become as famous as he's become without traveling. You know, I don't think that would happen anymore.
He's one of the things that funnily enough, I thought of when you were talking before, Gavin, you know, in terms of like loyalty, because I was talking to my lads are like both in their late 30s now, but they have like no real concept of the testimonial. That used to be the big thing, didn't it? You know, that kept you there was the fact that you got a testimonial out of it, whereas they don't need it now, do they, Rin?
No, and generally, if I remember rightly, a testimonial was what, 10 years service at a club, I think.
10 years.
And like, there's not many players stay at a club for 10 years now, which is crazy, you know. I'd be very interested to look at the Premier League as an example and see, are there any of the top sides that have players there that are longer than 10 years?
Yeah.
So, Gav, going back, because we got massively sidetracked, but
sorry about that.
That's the beauty of it. What team did you think that if Pele came to Europe, where did you actually place him?
I actually really liked the idea of him playing at Milan, to be fair, because one, when I looked at so again, that go back to what we were talking about earlier. I don't think he would have been taken if that famous Real Madrid side, as an example, even if he came on their radar, you know, around 58, 59, I just don't think he'd get into that side at the time because he was 17. He was unproven. And they were a hell of a side, and they still had 2 more European Cups in them. So after that, the Benfica one I thought could fit just because of the whole Brazilian connection, the language barrier, the Eusebio connection. I think that would have appealed to him. But certainly the Milan one, I like that idea. I really do. And I think when you look at how they really became a powerhouse themselves over. So AC Milan won it, I think, 63, but Inter are in 3 of the next 4 finals. Like, so if you're a player from the outside looking in, they probably seem attractive. And at this point in his life now, Pele is established. He has 2 World Cups under his belt. He's won 2 World Cups. So he's now undoubtedly a football star. And he probably himself would look to want to go to one of the bigger clubs. So Inter Milan is an obvious attraction. So I think that's a really, really good fit. And then
do you think if he'd have played in Europe? Sorry, Gavin. Do you think if he'd have played in Europe, you know, in the early 60s, that he'd have been streetwise enough not to have got kicked out of the 66 World Cup?
Maybe. And you got to remember, we don't have much evidence, but he did play. So you remember in the early 60s, the winner of the European Cup played the winner of the Copa Libertadores. Santos did play. I think they played AC Milan 63 and they played Benfica back in 62. So, and Pele, he was injured actually for 2 of the games against Milan, but he did play against like top European sides 3 times and he scored 7 goals. Yeah. So, you know, 7 goals out of 3 games against, at the time, European Cup opposition winners is a pretty good return. So I think he was clever enough to play against anybody. I definitely think, and look, again, I don't have as much knowledge of South American football as I might have European football, but that was no cakewalk either. South American football was pretty robust back then as well. You know, there was lots of physicality in the game there. So I don't think it's something that would have been totally unusual to him. Like there was some famous Uruguayan sides in the 60s that would kill you. You know, they'd literally cut you down. So I don't think it would have been alien to him. But I probably think he would have thrived, because I would imagine at the time the European football may have been more tactical. He might have been smarter for it. I don't know. But it is fascinating to think, how he would have adapted to that different style of football.
The fact that he scored those goals against those big teams, Peter, was one of the reasons you thought, justified his goal-scoring record, wasn't it?
Yeah, so amongst these friendlies that have been discounted, they did lots and lots of tours of Europe, and Pele played, I can't remember the exact number without opening the book in front of me, but he would have played something like 30 games or close to 30 games against European teams. We talk about friendlies. These friendlies would have more the status of a international friendly, like when England played Germany in a friendly, prestige friendlies. So they were slightly more competitive friendlies, let's put it that way. They had a bit more on them. And he scored almost a goal a game in these games, in these games against top European sides. So I have no doubt that he would have scored in European football. He, as we mentioned earlier, he scores 3 goals against France. He scores 2 goals against Sweden. Yeah. He scores goals against European international teams. I can't see a reason why he wouldn't score goals in Serie A. And the other reason for placing him in Serie A above putting him in La Liga is because it's recognized as defensively the best league in the world ever. Whatever era you look at, that's where the defending is most prized and most important. We talked about Herrera playing Catenaccio and it being copied and everyone tightening up in Italy. And he would still have scored. To score 20 goals a season in Serie A, which he probably would have done against the best defenders in the world, I think that would just cement his reputation even further. And a good example of that is someone like Van Basten and the number of goals that Van Basten scored playing for Milan.
Yeah.
He didn't get 20 goals every season, but that's because of how tough it was and historically has been out in Serie A.
Yeah, totally agree.
I mean, I've just got Van Basten's record up in front of me. I say he didn't score 20 goals every season. He scored 20 league goals in one season, only one of his seasons in Serie A.
Right.
And everyone knows what his reputation as a goal scorer was.
Yeah.
I won't even bring up Ian Rush's loan season in Serie A. We know how many goals he scored in England. I don't think he got to double figures in his Serie A season.
It's quite interesting. Nick. Jimmy Greaves is always seen as a failure, but he was almost a goal a game.
Yeah,
he didn't play that many games, but he was still almost a goal a game, and then got the chance to come home, didn't he? And he bit the hand off. I always think that's like language, really, as much as anything. But
Ian Rush with over 200 league goals for Liverpool got 7 goals in 29 Serie A games.
There you go.
Yeah. No, great point. Yeah, great point. And you would imagine that Pele scoring at the rate that he scored, would have certainly been comfortably getting 20 goals plus a season.
Yeah, because it was still possible. I mean, I've just played down goal scoring exploits in Serie A, but it was still possible to score a high number of goals a season. Just look at Batistuta, for example. He did score 20 goals a season.
You mentioned John Charles there earlier. Like famously, I think he scored 28 goals in his best season out there.
Blimey.
That's a hell of a return.
Yeah, especially from a centre half.
But no, listen, I think it's just this and all of the other what ifs you can come up with. It's fascinating because we can sit here and talk forever about it.
Go on, Gavin. Where do you put him then in terms of the GOAT, Pele? Where do you put him? Let's press you on that. Where do you?
Oh no, for me, he's the greatest. Like for me, he's the greatest. And for me, and I've been very fortunate enough to see all the coverage of Messi in recent years. For me, he's absolutely Messi's my number 2. But Pele for me will always be the greatest, just in terms of he was a trailblazer. Just what he did for the game of football globally, both on and off the pitch. As we rightly said earlier, he's probably up there with the Muhammad Alis of this world in terms of his global appeal. The guy is dead, unfortunately, and he still lives on in the memory and is still, held in such high regard around the footballing world. And it's just brilliant that we now, with modern technology, have better footage and more footage of his playing career. And there's the likes of the documentary you mentioned earlier. There's countless documentaries on Pele, but anytime I watch anything to do with the guy, I still find myself as mesmerized by him as I was as a kid. And the only other player who's ever done that to me is Messi. Like I've watched Messi do things on a football pitch that I just think are incredible, but Pele did that to me first, so I'll never forget that. And I think back, like, briefly, you think of his header that Gordon Banks famously saved, one of the most iconic moments in football. The time he dummies the keeper, goes around the keeper against the Czechs and misses, one of the most famous misses in football. One of the first guys I ever saw shoot from the halfway line, and you're thinking, what the hell is he doing? He scores overhead kicks, he dribbles and does flicks and tricks long before I saw anybody do that kind of stuff. So he kind of just really, really made an imprint on me as a young, kid and then a young player. And then as I got older and got obviously more interested in coaching and learning and becoming a student of the game itself, he was someone that you could and still can watch and learn from. So for me, he's absolutely the greatest.
It's interesting you pick those 3 things, like the misses almost. But one of my lasting, my personal lasting memory of him is that pass to Carlos Alberto.
Oh,
it's such a pass, that, isn't it? It just is.
The weight of that pass, he looks so in control when he's playing it. Like he's in a World Cup final. He's just after scoring one of the best headers I've ever seen in the final. And he's so cool. And he's playing it like it is his testimonial. Like he's strolling around. I have to say, I never heard this quote, and it's in your book. But Tarcio Burnick, who marked him in the 70 final, said afterwards, he says, I kept telling myself before the game, he's made of skin and bones like everybody else. He said, but I was wrong. So like the guy that marked him in that 70 final came off going, oh my God, this guy's not human. So I just love watching him play the game. And as I said, the only other player I've seen in my day, and there's been some greats over all the last couple of decades, but Messi, when he's in his full flow, plays the game like that, where he just looks in total control of what he's doing. And Pele always struck me as a guy who more often than not just looked in perfect control of the way he wanted to play the game. And it was just a joy to watch. Still is.
And on that note, do you want to call that full time, Mr. Prickett?
Cool. Brilliant stuff. Thank you very much for coming on, Gav. It's been a great chat.
It's been a pleasure, boys, and continued success. I've said it before. I'll say it again, that your book, The Moments That Could Have Changed Football Forever, is highly recommended. There's some brilliant what-if scenarios in there. I hope you continue to do more and more of them. I've thoroughly enjoyed being involved in chatting about the Pele one. I think we could chat about it for hours more, but I will just leave you with saying, as far as I'm concerned, I definitely think Pele could have played in Europe and would still be considered one of the greatest.
Before we go, do you want to remind people where they can find you on social media and elsewhere?
Yeah, no, absolutely. You'll generally find me on Twitter or X or whatever it's called these days, at Coaching Badges. Come on, as we said just before we came on air, there's a fantastic community of coaches out there willing to help each other, learn from each other, share with each other. And it's been a privilege to share and engage with the likes of yourselves over the last number of years, and to get to chat tonight's been an absolute privilege. So thank you. But yeah, look, continued success with your own ventures, and we'll absolutely keep in touch.
Brilliant.
Thank you very much. Bye, everyone.
Press stop.
What if Brian Clough had managed England?
What if Ronaldo and Messi had played together?
What if Pep Guardiola managed in League Two?
These are just some of the things discussed in a brand new book, moments that could have changed football forever. Every football fan has a what-if moment that they know would have brought their team glory if things had turned out differently. Every what-if moment in the book has been chosen to spark debate amongst football fans. Buy your copy now online at Amazon or Waterstones and let us know what's your favourite what-if moment in football history.